Hello, Goddess Garden Book Chat. Welcome back to 28 Days, 28 Books, our reading challenge, and we are at book 25. Race Matters by Cornel West is an amazing journey, and I hope if you haven't read the book when it was originally released back in the early 90s, you get a chance to enjoy the audiobook that has been re-released for the 25th anniversary of this book. This deep dive tells you all about it. I read it back when it was in hardcover, and it was such a great and enjoyable story, very relevant. And I think time-wise, I see why it's such a relevant read for 25th anniversary release. I will also include that there is a link here after you get done with the deep dive that takes you to a Discord conversation that I've created for our book club as a guided sort of deep dive if you really want to find out ways that you can get involved in this conversation and get involved in what can possibly be a better way forward as we converse with each other. So without further ado, let's get into Race Matters. I hope you enjoy this. And we're so much closer to finishing, guys. We're almost there. Yay us. Okay, enjoy the read.
Welcome to our deep dive on Cornel West's Race Matters. Well, actually, the 25th anniversary edition.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's what makes it so interesting. It's more than just a reprint. It's an audiobook.
Yeah.
Narrated by Cornel West herself and J.D. Jackson.
Having West's voice there, that passion, that urgency, it adds a whole new layer to his arguments about race and justice. But before we get into all of that,
Right.
Let's rewind back to 1993 for a second. A country still reeling from the Reagan era, the Clinton administration just starting out. The struggle for racial equality, as always, ongoing.
Yeah.
That's where Race Matters kind of dropped into the scene. It sparked national conversations.
It did. It wasn't just another book. It really was a phenomenon. It sparked all this debate, all this reflection among activists, scholars, and just, everyday people.
And fast forward to 2018, right? We've seen a black president elected, the Black Lives Matter movement rising up, and then tragically a resurgence of this, like very open racial violence. So the question is, why bring Race Matters back in this audio format?
Well, because the work is far from over. Bringing West's voice directly to listeners, especially, maybe a newer generation, it's a way to re-energize this conversation about race in America.
And there's something about hearing his voice. I mean, it just makes you listen.
Right.
It makes you really grapple with his ideas. So let's get into it. What are some of the core themes that West explores? The ones that are still so powerful today?
Oh, man. Well, one of the most critical themes is the whole notion of democracy.
Okay.
West argues that for you to truly have democracy, it's got to be more than just voting. It requires real participation.
Right.
A willingness to think critically, to challenge injustice, and to hold power accountable.
He actually says, to engage in democratic practice is to be willing to think critically, challenge injustice, and hold power accountable.
Powerful stuff.
And it goes hand in hand with West's critique of black leadership. He doesn't hold back.
No, he doesn't.
He asks you to consider, are some black leaders more focused on appearances than actually serving their community?
Right.
He calls for authenticity, accountability,
Absolutely.
a real commitment to helping those who are most marginalized.
Yeah. He says, black leadership today is too often about polished postures and market-driven images rather than deep commitment to the least of these.
Which, when you think about the complexities black leaders face today,
Yeah.
it's a really powerful statement. And then there's the big one, right? White supremacy. West confronts it head on. He goes beyond just individual prejudice and exposes how it's built into our systems and structures.
It's not just about isolated incidents of racism, right? It's about whiteness being privileged at every level.
Yeah.
Often in ways you don't even notice.
He says white supremacy is not just about individual prejudice. It is about the systematic privileging of whiteness in every major institution of American life. I mean, it makes you wonder, how do you even begin to untangle something that's so deeply rooted?
It's a big question. And that's where West's message of hope comes in, He argues that hope isn't just wishful thinking, it's something you actively cultivate. Through struggle, through community, and by constantly pursuing justice. It's about knowing that you can be a part of change.
He says, hope is not some abstract thing. It is born out of struggle, nourished by community, and sustained by the courage to fight for justice. So let's bring it all together. How do West's insights from 25 years ago connect with what we're seeing today in 2025?
Honestly, it's kind of amazing how relevant race matters feels right now. We're still dealing with many of the same problems Wes identified back then. Police brutality,
Yeah.
mass incarceration,
Right.
economic inequality, the lingering effects of racial trauma.
It feels like we take a couple of steps forward and then something pulls us right back.
Exactly. It's like
Yeah.
there's this undercurrent that just keeps dragging us down. And that's why his call for a more engaged, more morally grounded democracy feels so important now.
Yay.
You can't rely on politicians or institutions to fix this. Real change requires you to get involved, to be willing to challenge things, to fight for what's right.
So what does this mean for our listeners? Why should this book matter to them today?
Because Race Matters isn't just history, it's a wake-up call.
Okay.
It challenges you to understand the history of racism, to confront your own biases, and to play an active role in creating a more just world. It's about looking at yourself and asking, what am I doing to either perpetuate these systems or to dismantle them?
It's about those tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable, even when they challenge your own viewpoints.
Exactly.
So the audiobook format, it has this whole other level, right? It's not just reading, it's feeling those words.
That's where it gets really interesting. What if you take West's call to action beyond just listening? What if you actually try to make a difference?
Well, he talks about how important collective struggle and community engagement are.
Right.
It's realizing that you're not alone in this fight.
Absolutely.
It's about coming together, working with others, and supporting the organizations that are fighting for racial justice.
And understanding that racial justice isn't a destination, it's a journey.
Yeah.
It's a constant process of learning, unlearning, and relearning.
And it's knowing that all of us have a role to play, no matter how big or small. Every action counts. Every conversation, every act of resistance, it all adds up.
It does. So if our listeners are feeling fired up and want to get involved,
Yeah.
the first thing is education.
Okay.
Race Matters is a good place to start, but it's just a start.
Right.
There are tons of resources out there. Books, podcasts, documentaries.
And don't just stick to one perspective.
Right. No, seek out diverse voices, especially Black authors and thinkers.
Right.
Then look for ways to get involved in your community. Volunteer your time.
Right.
Donate to organizations fighting for racial justice.
And don't underestimate the power of talking to people. Talk to your friends and family about this stuff. Share what you learn.
Right.
Challenge those harmful stereotypes. Open up a space for dialogue. Remember, change starts with each of us.
It does. It's about recognizing our own role in things, challenging our biases, and actively being part of the solution.
It's about taking our anger and turning it into action. Taking our despair and turning it into hope. And turning our words into deeds. We've talked about how white supremacy is embedded in American society. But what about the systems of oppression that exist globally? How can we use West's ideas to address racism and injustice around the world?
That's a huge question, and it's one that deserves a deep dive all on its own.
Right.
West's insights into race, democracy, and justice, they really hit home, even decades later.
They do. It's like Race Matters is this mirror, reflecting not just the realities of 1993, but the fight for racial equality that we're still having today. One thing that really stayed with me from last time was West's critique of Black leadership.
It's so timely, right? His call for authenticity, for accountability over charisma and politics.
It's a challenge for any leader, really, not just Black leaders. Are we truly serving those who need it most? Or are we just worried about our own image? And it's a question for everyone, not just those in official positions.
Exactly. Are we using our power to help others or to keep things the same? That's some serious self-reflection we need to do.
And then there's West's analysis of white supremacy. He doesn't shy away from it.
No, he goes right at it. Makes you see how it's woven into everything, our institutions, our everyday lives.
Yeah, it's not just about individual prejudice, right?
It's about how whiteness is privileged, how it's the norm at every level, often working in subtle ways you don't even see at first.
What's important is his call to action. It's not enough to just recognize the problem. We have to actively work to dismantle these systems.
That's where his emphasis on collective action comes in, building coalitions across racial and socioeconomic lines to fight for justice, recognizing our interconnectedness and using our collective power to change things.
He's all about community engagement, not just protests, but doing the daily work to create a more equitable society. What's fascinating is it doesn't have to be grand gestures. Small, consistent actions can build into something bigger.
Exactly. Every little act of resistance, every conversation, every time you educate yourself or someone else, It all ripples out.
And this is where his message of hope is so powerful. It's not just wishful thinking. It's something we create.
Through our struggles, our connections, and our commitment to justice.
And the audiobook format adds another layer to this. You hear his voice.
It's powerful, isn't it?
His passion, his urgency. It's like he's speaking directly to you.
Challenging you to confront these uncomfortable truths, to see your own biases, to be responsible for making things better.
It's like a gut punch reminder that these aren't abstract ideas, they're people's lives.
We have a duty to listen, to learn, to act.
So how do we translate that message into action? It can be overwhelming, knowing where to even begin.
Oh, it is. But Wes reminds us that change starts with each of us.
Right.
It's about educating ourselves, confronting our own biases, and challenging racist language and behavior when we see it.
It can be as simple as calling out a racist joke or talking to a friend about microaggressions.
Right, and supporting organizations that are fighting for racial justice, using our voices to amplify marginalized voices, pushing for policies that promote equity.
And remembering that this is a marathon, not a sprint. There will be setbacks, but we can't give up hope.
West reminds us that hope is not naive, it's defiant. It's believing that even when things seem impossible, change can happen if we fight for it.
One thing that struck me about Race Matters is that it's not just about race.
It's about America itself, right? Our shared history, our responsibility, and our potential to create a better society for everyone.
It's about taking back those democratic ideals, creating a society where everyone can thrive, no matter their race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status.
And recognizing that until we deal with white supremacy, until we dismantle the systems that keep it going, we'll never have true justice.
As we continue our deep dive, I want to look at one of West's most powerful themes, the connection between hope and despair.
Interesting. How do you hold on to hope when you see so much injustice, so much inequality?
It's a question people have wrestled with forever. And West offers this perspective that's both challenging and inspiring.
He says they're two sides of the same coin, right? Hope and despair, inextricably linked in this fight for liberation.
He writes, hope is not some abstract thing. It is born out of struggle, nourished by community, and sustained by the courage to fight for justice. It's not about ignoring the pain, but finding the strength to keep fighting, even when it feels impossible. He acknowledges the despair, but encourages us to turn it into action.
And that's where community becomes crucial. In those connections, in our shared struggles and triumphs, we find the resilience to keep going.
West talks about a love ethic, recognizing our shared humanity and working to build a more just and loving world. He sees love as a force for change, to break down barriers and build bridges.
It's a radical vision, right? To move beyond our own individual concerns and think about the well-being of everyone.
It reminds us that fighting for justice isn't just about changing laws, it's about changing hearts and minds. Creating a world where everyone feels valued, respected, loved. It takes a real shift in how we think and act.
Absolutely. It requires us to look at our own beliefs, our own behaviors, and to become more compassionate, more understanding people. So how do we cultivate this love ethic in a world that often feels so full of hate and division? It's a question for our listeners.
It takes some soul searching, doesn't it?
It does. We need to examine our own biases, to commit to being more empathetic, more compassionate. That means actively seeking out different perspectives, being willing to have those tough conversations, even when it's uncomfortable.
And remembering that love isn't passive. It's an active force that takes courage, commitment, and a willingness to stand up for what's right.
West calls for a radical love.
All right.
A love that's fierce, that's unwavering in its pursuit of justice. A love that sees the dignity in every human being and refuses to accept oppression.
A love that fuels our hope and empowers us to keep fighting for a world where everyone can live in freedom and dignity. As we go deeper into these complex issues of race, justice, and the human condition, I want to ask our listeners, how can we each embody this radical love in our own lives?
It's a powerful question. How do we go beyond just tolerating each other and truly love one another, especially those who are different from us? It challenges us to really think about our own capacity for love, for compassion.
How can we challenge our own biases, our own prejudices? How can we create a world where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued?
These are essential questions for anyone who's serious about creating a more just and equitable society.
It's a journey, isn't it?
A lifelong one. Learning, unlearning, and it begins with the simple act of love. Being willing to listen, to understand, to act with compassion.
It's been quite a journey exploring these complex issues of race, democracy, and justice through his lens.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground, from his critique of Black leadership to his analysis of white supremacy, and of course his call for a more just and equitable society.
We've talked about hope as defiance, the power of community, and the potential of radical love. But before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier, the power of the audiobook format.
It's not just about information, is it? It's about experiencing those words, hearing West's voice, that conviction. It adds a level of depth you don't get from just reading.
It's like he's right there with you, challenging you to think critically, to confront those hard truths.
It's an invitation to feel his arguments, not just understand them, to let them resonate on a deeper level.
And that's where real change starts, I think, when we move beyond just knowing about injustice to actually feeling it
Yeah,
and letting that feeling drive us to action.
absolutely. It's in those moments of connection when we truly listen and allow ourselves to be challenged that we can spark real change. And West does an amazing job of weaving personal stories with those complex analyses, which makes the audiobook even more powerful.
So as we come to the end of our deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with one final question to think about.
Okay, I'm all ears.
West talks about the need for new frameworks to understand race and racism. He wants us to go beyond traditional ideologies and embrace a more radical vision of justice.
He argues that we need new language, new ways of thinking and talking about race to really grasp the complexities of the 21st century.
And it makes me wonder, what could these new frameworks look like? How can we reimagine these conversations about race so they're more nuanced, more inclusive, so they actually help us dismantle these systems of oppression?
That's a big question. It requires us to be creative, to think outside the box, to challenge our current ways of talking about race, and to acknowledge that there's no easy fix. This is a long process.
It's about embracing the possibility of change, of imagining a world where race isn't a barrier, where it doesn't divide us. And to get there, we have to actively challenge the way things are and fight for policies that promote equity and justice.
Right. And I think Wes would push us to be bold in our imaginations, to dream big, and to never give up on the fight for a better society. Even in the darkest times, hope is what guides us.
And hope isn't passive. It's fueled by action, by community. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Race Matters. It's been an honor to explore this work with you. I hope it's inspired you to engage more deeply with West's ideas and continue this crucial conversation.
Remember, this doesn't end here. Keep learning, keep challenging yourself, and keep fighting for justice. Every step we take, no matter how small, brings us closer to a more just and equitable world.
Race still matters, and it's up to all of us to keep that conversation going. It takes all of us, learning and unlearning together, working towards a better future for everyone.